the frosty clink of ice in a crystal glass, the low murmur of conversations worth millions, the scent of truffle oil and old money. This was the air Gideon Hale breathed, and he considered it his native element. Seated opposite him was Tiffany, a woman as gleaming and new as his custom Patek Philippe. He smirked, looking at her, then surveying the room at L'Étoile Privée, the city's most impenetrable restaurant. This was his victory lap. And then he saw her, his ex-wife, Amelia, tucked away at a small table, looking exactly as he remembered her. Plain, forgettable. He was about to make a joke to Tiffany, to point out the little mouse who dared to enter the lion's den, when he saw the man she was with, and the world Gideon had so carefully constructed began to fracture. Gideon Hale believed the world was a hierarchy, a glittering pyramid he had successfully climbed. At its peak were men like him. Below, far below, were the others, the masses, the mediocrities, and, as of a year ago, his ex-wife, Amelia. Tonight was a testament to his ascent. L'Étoile Privée wasn't merely a restaurant, it was a theater of power. Getting a reservation required more than money. It required a name, a reputation that preceded you. Gideon's name, he was pleased to note, now opened such doors with a satisfying click. "Isn't it divine, Giddy?" Tiffany purred, her fingers tipped with blood-red nails, tracing the rim of her champagne flute. She was 24, an aspiring influencer whose primary aspiration seemed to be documenting her life with him. Her beauty was of the modern, manufactured variety, sharp, symmetrical, and utterly devoid of warmth. She was, in Gideon's eyes, the perfect accessory, a human equivalent of his silver Aston Martin, DB11, sleek, fast, and a clear signal to the world that he could afford the very best. "It's adequate," Gideon replied, a lazy smile playing on his lips. He leaned back in the plush velvet banquette, absorbing the ambiance. The lighting was low and intimate, making the diamonds on Tiffany's wrist glitter like captured stars. The air hummed with the quiet confidence of the truly wealthy. To his left, a shipping magnate was negotiating a deal in hushed Greek. To his right, a celebrated actress was laughing with her director. Gideon felt a surge of profound satisfaction. He belonged here. He had earned this. He thought back to his life with Amelia, a life of muted colors, a sensible sedan, holidays in comfortable but unexciting resorts, dinners at home where she'd talk about her day, managing the house and his social calendar. She had been the sturdy, reliable scaffolding that had allowed him to build his empire. And like all scaffolding, she had been dismantled and discarded once the structure was complete. He had told her as much during their final, brutal argument. "You don't get it, Amelia," he had sneered, watching her pack a cardboard box with her books, her face pale and tear-streaked. "I've outgrown this. I've outgrown you. I'm heading for the stratosphere, and you're terrestrial." Now, sitting in the stratosphere, he felt vindicated. Tiffany was his co-pilot, a woman who understood the language of luxury and excess. She didn't challenge him or talk about tedious things like emotional connection or shared dreams. She admired his stock portfolio and praised his choice in wine. It was a simple, clean transaction. "Oh my God, look," Tiffany whispered, her voice a conspiratorial hiss. She gestured with her chin towards a corner of the restaurant. "Is that?" Gideon followed her gaze, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. And there she was, Amelia. It was like seeing a sparrow in an eagle's nest. She was sitting at a two-person table, partially obscured by a large floral arrangement. A wave of something between pity and contempt washed over him. He could imagine how she'd managed it, probably saved up for months. Or perhaps it was a birthday gift from a well-meaning but clueless friend. The thought was almost pathetic. "Well, well," Gideon murmured, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "Talk about a fish out of water." Tiffany giggled, a sharp, artificial sound. "What is she even wearing? It looks like a librarian's uniform. And who is she with? He's turned away, but he looks so average." Gideon leaned forward, squinting. Amelia had her back mostly to them, but he could see her profile. She was wearing a simple, dark-colored dress. No jewelry that he could see. She looked exactly as he'd left her, sensible, unremarkable, and entirely out of place. He felt a perverse need to confirm his superiority, to witness her awkwardness in this temple of success. He was about to make another cutting remark when the man with her shifted in his seat, turning slightly. Gideon didn't recognize him. The man's suit was dark and exquisitely tailored, but it wasn't flashy. He wore no ostentatious watch or gaudy rings. There was a stillness about him, an economy of movement that spoke of immense self-assurance. He listened intently as Amelia spoke, his focus entirely on her. Then Jean-Luc, the restaurant's famously haughty maitre d', approached their table. Gideon watched, expecting the man to be deferential, but swift, as he was with most guests. But the interaction was different. Jean-Luc bowed his head slightly, a gesture of genuine respect Gideon had never seen him bestow on anyone. He spoke in a low voice, and the man with Amelia nodded, smiling faintly. Jean-Luc then retreated, but not before casting a warm, almost paternal smile at Amelia. Gideon's own greeting from Jean-Luc had been professionally courteous, but cool. He had tipped heavily to secure this specific, prominent table. Yet this unknown man and his mousy ex-wife were receiving a level of service reserved for royalty. A flicker of unease, tiny but sharp, pierced Gideon's bubble of smugness. Why would Jean-Luc, a man who could snub billionaires without a second thought, show such deference to Amelia's date? Probably a hotel manager or something, Tiffany sniffed, clearly bored with the topic. "Can we order the Caspian sea oysters, Giddy? I want to post them on my story." "In a minute," Gideon said, his eyes still fixed on the table in the corner. Amelia laughed at something her companion said, a genuine, unburdened sound that he hadn't heard from her in years. It wasn't the polite, strained titter of the wife of a rising star. It was the free, joyful laugh of a woman who was exactly where she wanted to be. The sight of it, the sound of it, was inexplicably irritating. He had written her off as a casualty of his success, a footnote in his biography. He had expected her to fade into a life of quiet desperation in the suburbs. But here she was, in his world, in his sanctuary of success, and for the first time that night, Gideon Hale felt a cold premonition that he had fundamentally misunderstood the story he was in. He wasn't just the hero. He was about to become the spectator. Gideon tried to dismiss it. He turned his attention back to Tiffany, nodding as she prattled on about a rival influencer's trip to Dubai. He ordered the most expensive bottle of Chateau Margaux on the wine list, a vintage that cost more than the mortgage payments on the house he and Amelia had once shared. It was a power move, a way to reassert his dominance over the room, over the memory of his past. The sommelier, a man with a silver-tasting cup hanging from a chain around his neck, treated the bottle with the reverence of a holy relic. Gideon made sure to swirl the deep red liquid, inhale its bouquet of black currant and cedar, and pronounce it acceptable with an air of studied nonchalance. But his eyes kept drifting back to Amelia's table. The unease was growing, coalescing into a knot in his stomach. It wasn't just the maitre d's deference. It was Amelia herself. As she turned to speak to a passing waiter, the light from a nearby sconce caught her full profile, and Gideon's carefully constructed image of her began to crumble. The dress he had dismissed as a librarian's uniform, was, on closer inspection, a masterpiece of understated elegance. It was a deep sapphire blue, cut from a material that draped over her frame with the fluidity of liquid silk. It was a design by the row, a brand that screamed wealth to those who knew, and was invisible to those who didn't. There was a single piece of jewelry on her wrist, a delicate platinum bracelet that shimmered with a line of flawless diamonds. It wasn't loud or gaudy, it was refined, exquisite. He had never bought her anything so tasteful. His gifts had always been chunkier, more obvious declarations of his wealth. And her face. The woman he remembered was perpetually tired, her features softened by a constant, low-level stress. The woman across the room was luminous. Her skin glowed. Her hair, which she used to pull back in a practical ponytail, was now styled in soft, elegant waves that framed a face that was serene and confident. She wasn't just present in this opulent room, she belonged in it. More than Tiffany, with her desperate-to-impress glamour, and perhaps a horrifying thought, even more than him. "She looks different," Gideon said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "Different how?" Tiffany asked, pausing her meticulous application of lip gloss. "She got a haircut?" "Big deal. You could buy and sell her 100 times over, honey. Don't waste your breath." But he wasn't so sure. He was a man who understood power, and the quiet, immense power emanating from that corner table was making the air around his own feel thin and brittle. He watched as Amelia's companion leaned in, handing her a leather-bound folio. She opened it, and her expression became focused, professional. They weren't just making small talk. They were working. Here? In l'Étoile Privée on a Friday night? That was the ultimate power play, to treat the most exclusive restaurant in the city as your personal office. Gideon's mind began to race, trying to place the man. He was in his late 50s, perhaps early 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a patrician face that seemed carved from granite. He looked familiar, but Gideon couldn't place him. He wasn't one of the usual suspects from the finance world. He wasn't a tech bro or a flashy real estate mogul. He was something else. Old money, established power, the kind of man who didn't need to post his successes on social media because he owned the platforms they were posted on. Suddenly, a man peeled away from a nearby table and approached them. Gideon recognized him instantly. Robert Chen, the notoriously ruthless CEO of a venture capital firm that had been in the news for a hostile takeover. Chen was a shark, a man who made Gideon look like a guppy. Gideon watched, fascinated, as Chen approached Amelia's table, not with a swagger, but with an air of distinct deference. He didn't speak to Amelia, he spoke to the man. "Mr. Beaumont," Chen said, his voice carrying across the hushed room, "I didn't realize you were in town. My apologies for interrupting." The name struck Gideon with the force of a physical blow. Beaumont, as in Lawrence Beaumont, the reclusive, almost mythical founder and CEO of Beaumont Global. A man who moved markets with a single-word pronouncement. A titan of industry whose net worth was a subject of speculative articles in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, because no one knew the true figure. He was a ghost, a legend. He almost never appeared in public, and he was having dinner with Amelia. Gideon felt the blood drain from his face. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was impossible. It made no sense. Amelia, his bland, unassuming ex-wife, was dining with a man who could buy Gideon's entire hedge fund with the interest he earned in a week. "Giddy? What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost," Tiffany said, waving a hand in front of his face. He couldn't speak. He just stared, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and disbelief. Lawrence Beaumont inclined his head slightly at Robert Chen. "Robert, good to see you. We're just having a discussion. We'll be in touch next week." It was a clear, polite dismissal. Chen, a man who terrified boards of directors, simply nodded and retreated. "Of course, Mr. Beaumont. My best to you both." He even gave Amelia a respectful nod before walking away. The entire exchange took less than 30 seconds, but for Gideon, time had warped. The Chateau Margaux in his glass suddenly seemed like cheap table wine. His Patek Philippe felt like a plastic toy. The confident smirk that was his default expression had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed stare. Amelia and Lawrence Beaumont. She wasn't on a date with some middle manager. She was in a dinner meeting, with one of the most powerful men on the planet. And from the easy familiarity between them, the shared smiles, the intense focus of their conversation, Gideon realized with a sickening, plummeting certainty. This wasn't their first meeting. This wasn't even business. This was something far, far more significant. The restaurant, with its gilded ceilings and crystal chandeliers, suddenly felt like a courtroom, and Gideon was in the dock. The ghost haunting him wasn't Lawrence Beaumont. It was the woman Amelia used to be, the woman he had created and then destroyed. The memories, which he had so successfully suppressed, came flooding back with the force of a tidal wave. He remembered Amelia in their first apartment, a cramped one-bedroom with peeling paint and a view of a brick wall. She was in her final year of her architecture master's program at Columbia, her desk perpetually buried under blueprints, sketches, and models of futuristic, sustainable buildings. Her passion was palpable. She would talk for hours about green roofs, passive solar design, and creating spaces that were in harmony with their environment. Her eyes would light up, and her energy could have powered the entire city block. He had found it charming, in a quaint, academic sort of way. At the time, he was a junior analyst at a brokerage firm, working 80-hour weeks and subsisting on coffee and ambition. Amelia was his rock. She was the one who made sure there was food in the fridge, who typed up his reports when he was too exhausted to see straight, who proofread his presentations, adding a polish and clarity that got him noticed by the senior partners. She was the one who celebrated his tiny victories with a bottle of cheap wine and unwavering belief in his potential. "You're going to be a titan, Gideon," she used to whisper to him at night, her head on his chest. "I can feel it." Her own dreams were put on hold. "Just until you get established," she'd say. "Once your first big bonus comes in, I'll start my own firm. We'll do it together." He got the bonus. It was bigger than they had ever imagined. They bought a larger apartment, then a house in the suburbs. He was promoted, then promoted again. His star was rising, and Amelia was the silent, efficient stage manager of his life. She organized the dinner parties that charmed his clients, remembered the names of his boss's children, and chose the perfect Christmas gifts for his entire department. She was brilliant at it. The effortless grace she exuded made him look good, made him seem like a man who had his life perfectly in order. But her own life was being put away, packed into boxes like her old architecture books and stored in the attic. When she brought up her dream of starting a firm, he would demur. "Not now, sweetheart," he'd say, patting her hand distractedly while checking stock tickers on his phone. "The market is too volatile. And besides, I need you. Who else could possibly manage everything? You're my secret weapon." He had framed it as a compliment, but it was a cage. He saw her talent not as something to be nurtured, but as a resource to be exploited for his own benefit. The light in her eyes began to dim. The conversations about sustainable design were replaced by discussions about catering menus and guest lists. The woman who dreamed of changing skylines was now spending her days choosing fabric swatches for new curtains. The affair with Tiffany was not a mistake. It was a strategic decision. Tiffany was a confirmation of his new status. She was young, malleable, and utterly impressed by him. She didn't have complicated dreams that competed with his own. She was a reflection of his success, while Amelia had become a reminder of a past he wanted to forget, a past where he was a struggling junior analyst who needed her help. The divorce was his final, brutal act of erasure. He remembered her sitting across from him in their cavernous, minimalist living room, his lawyer by his side. She looked small and broken. "I gave you the best years of my life, Gideon," she had said, her voice trembling. He had responded with a chillingly calm cruelty. "And I paid for them. You have this house, for now. You have a generous settlement. You lived a life of luxury you could never have achieved on your own. What more do you want?" "My life back," she had whispered. He had laughed then, a short, sharp, dismissive sound. "What life, Amelia? You're a homemaker in your late 30s with a dusty, useless degree. Your moment has passed. You'll be nothing without me. You should be grateful for what I'm giving you." He truly believed it. He had convinced himself that he was the creator of her world, and without him, that world would cease to exist. He had left her in that sterile, white living room, feeling not a shred of guilt, only the exhilarating freedom of a man shedding a dead weight. Now, sitting in L'Étoile Privée, watching that nothing of a woman command the attention of Lawrence Beaumont, Gideon felt a profound and terrifying re-evaluation of history. He hadn't been her creator. He had been her jailer. He hadn't been her provider. He had been her parasite. All that passion, all that brilliance he had tried to smother and redirect for his own purposes hadn't died. It had gone dormant. And now, in the presence of someone who clearly recognized its value, it had bloomed into something so radiant, it was blinding. He looked at Tiffany, who was now taking a selfie, making a pouty face at her phone. The comparison was suddenly grotesque. He had traded a rare, unique masterpiece for a cheap, mass-produced print. And the most galling part of it all was that he had done it willingly, arrogantly, believing he was making the deal of a lifetime. The wine in his mouth tasted sour, like ash and regret. The name hung in the air between Gideon and Tiffany, though only he understood its cataclysmic weight. Beaumont. "Beaumont?" Tiffany finally said, lowering her phone. "Why does that sound familiar? Is he an actor?" "He's not an actor, Tiffany," Gideon snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "He's Lawrence Beaumont, of Beaumont Global." Tiffany's perfectly arched eyebrows furrowed. "Beaumont Global. The ones who do stuff? Buildings and things?" "They don't just do stuff," Gideon hissed, his patience shredded. "They are one of the biggest private conglomerates on the planet. They're in sustainable tech, international logistics, next-generation urban planning. Governments court them. Nations rise and fall based on their investments. Lawrence Beaumont is so reclusive he's practically a myth. My firm has been trying to get a 10-minute introductory call with his acquisitions team for 6 months, and we can't even get past the third assistant." The comprehension slowly dawned on Tiffany's face, but it was filtered through her own transactional worldview. "Oh, so he's rich, like really rich. Richer than you?" The question was a dagger. "Yes, Tiffany," Gideon said through gritted teeth. "Richer than me. Richer than God." He watched them, his food forgotten on his plate. They were looking at blueprints. Even from across the room, he could recognize the distinctive, crisp blue lines on the large sheets of paper spread out on their table. Amelia was pointing to a specific section, her finger tracing a line as she spoke with animated precision. Lawrence Beaumont listened, his gaze fixed on her, nodding, his expression one of deep respect and concentration. He wasn't just humoring her. He was collaborating with her. It was then that Gideon overheard a snippet of their conversation, carried on the hushed air currents of the restaurant. "The residential sector will need a completely self-sustaining power grid," Amelia was saying, her voice clear and confident. "My design incorporates geothermal vents and a closed-loop water reclamation system. It's ambitious, but the schematics are sound." "It's not ambitious, Amelia," Beaumont's deep voice rumbled in reply. "It's revolutionary. The Helios project will be the new benchmark, and it will be because of your vision." The Helios project. Gideon felt a jolt, as if he'd touched a live wire. The Helios project was the stuff of legend in the financial and architectural worlds. A top-secret, multi-billion-dollar initiative by Beaumont Global to build the world's first fully sustainable, carbon-neutral city. It was the most significant architectural undertaking of the century. Firms from London to Tokyo were killing each other for a chance to even consult on a minor aspect of it. And Amelia wasn't a consultant. From the way Beaumont spoke to her, from the way she commanded the blueprints, Gideon understood the horrifying, impossible truth. She was the architect, the lead architect, the mind behind the entire revolutionary project, the dusty, useless degree he had mocked, the passion he had dismissed as a quaint hobby. It was the very thing that had brought her to this table, to the attention of a man like Lawrence Beaumont. All those years she was managing his life, her brilliant mind hadn't been idle. It had been observing, learning, refining. She hadn't forgotten her dreams. She had been sharpening them. Gideon felt a wave of vertigo. The entire narrative of his life was being rewritten before his eyes. He was not the hero who had left his boring wife behind. He was the fool who had discarded a winning lottery ticket because he was too arrogant to read the numbers. Tiffany, sensing the shift in power dynamics, grew agitated. Well, what is she to him? Is she his girlfriend? She's way too old for him. She must be after his money. "Quiet, Tiffany," Gideon warned. But his own mind was wrestling with the same questions, though with a far more terrifying conclusion. The way Beaumont looked at her wasn't just professional admiration. There was a warmth, a deep-seated affection there that went beyond blueprints and project deadlines. It was the look of a man who had found something, or someone, he cherished. He had thrown her away, and a king had walked by and picked her up from the gutter, recognizing her not as a discarded object, but as a misplaced crown. A toxic, burning jealousy, far more potent than anything he had ever felt, began to course through his veins. It wasn't about the money or the power. It was about the look in Beaumont's eyes. It was the look he, Gideon, had never once given her, because he had been too blind to see the woman who deserved it. And now, another man was seeing her for both of them, and Gideon knew, with absolute certainty, that he could never compete. In the mythology of his own mind, Gideon Hale did not retreat. He advanced. He conquered. He faced challenges head-on and bent them to his will. It was this deeply ingrained arrogance, now warring with a frantic, clawing desperation, that propelled him to his feet. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit there and watch his past eclipse his present. He had to reassert himself, to remind Amelia, and by extension the universe, of his own importance. "What are you doing?" Tiffany hissed, grabbing his arm. "I'm going to say hello," Gideon said, his voice a low growl. He smoothed his tie and straightened the jacket of his Tom Ford suit. He was Gideon Hale. He belonged in this room. He would not be rendered irrelevant. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. It was the Icarus maneuver, flying too close to the sun, fueled by nothing but hubris. He strode towards their table, Tiffany trailing in his wake like a bewildered, glittering tugboat. He plastered a smile on his face, the kind he used in hostile negotiations, all teeth and no warmth. Amelia and Lawrence looked up as his shadow fell over their table. There was no surprise in Amelia's eyes, only a calm, weary resignation, as if she were dealing with a minor, predictable annoyance, like a fly buzzing near her wine glass. "Amelia," Gideon began, his voice oozing a condescending familiarity. "Fancy seeing you here. This is a bit out of your usual price range, isn't it? Trying to climb the ladder, are we?" He let his gaze sweep over Beaumont, a silent, dismissive appraisal from one alpha to another. Amelia didn't flinch. She didn't blush or stammer or show any of the flustered weakness he had expected, that he had needed to see. She simply placed her fork down with quiet deliberation and looked at him with an unnerving placidity. "Gideon," she said, her voice even and cool. "How predictable of you to be here." Then she turned her gaze to her companion. "Lawrence, allow me to introduce Gideon Hale, my ex-husband." The words ex-husband were delivered with the flat, emotionless finality of a chapter title in a history book. Lawrence Beaumont did not stand. He did not offer his hand. He simply leaned back in his chair and looked up at Gideon, his grey eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter sea. It was not the confrontational glare of a rival. It was the utterly indifferent gaze of a celestial body observing an insect. "Hale," Beaumont said, the name sounding like something distasteful on his tongue. "Hale Capital Management." Gideon was momentarily stunned that Beaumont knew the name of his firm, a flicker of pride, which was immediately extinguished by what came next. "Yes," Beaumont continued, his voice quiet, but carrying the immense weight of his authority. "I saw your firm's prospectus on the Kensington Tower redevelopment. It was unimpressive. All leverage, no vision. My people flagged it as the work of vulture capitalists, not builders. We require partners who create value, Mr. Hale, not just extract it." Every word was a perfectly aimed shot, striking with surgical precision. To be dismissed so thoroughly, so publicly, by a man of Beaumont's stature was not just an insult, it was a professional execution. In the rarefied air of their world, a judgment like that from Lawrence Beaumont could be a death sentence. Gideon felt the blood rush to his face. He was speechless. Tiffany, sensing Gideon's humiliation, and perhaps seeing an opportunity to attach herself to a bigger whale, stepped forward with a dazzling, predatory smile. "Mr. Beaumont, it is such an honor," she gushed, extending her hand. "I'm Tiffany. I'm a huge admirer of your work. Gideon is just so proud of his ex-wife's success." Lawrence Beaumont's gaze flickered to her for a single, dismissive second before returning to Amelia, completely ignoring Tiffany's outstretched hand. He had rendered her invisible. Tiffany's hand hung in the air for a mortifying moment before she snatched it back, her face flushing a blotchy red. Beaumont then smiled, a genuine warm smile that transformed his severe features, and he directed it entirely at Amelia. "You were saying, my dear, about the solar panel efficiency in the northern quadrant?" He had not only dismissed Gideon and Tiffany, he had erased them. He had turned the full, focused power of his attention back to Amelia, creating an impenetrable bubble of intimacy and importance around their table for two, leaving Gideon and Tiffany standing on the outside, looking foolish and insignificant. They were annihilated, not with a shout, but with a whisper. There was nothing left for Gideon to do. He couldn't argue, he couldn't posture. He had brought a knife to a nuclear war, Defeated, he mumbled something incoherent and turned, practically dragging Tiffany back to their table. He sat down heavily, his body trembling with a mixture of rage and shame. He looked across at Amelia. She was already engrossed in her conversation with Beaumont again, a small, knowing smile on her lips. She hadn't needed to say a word in her own defense. She had a titan to do it for her. And Gideon knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, second only to the mistake of letting her go. The retreat back to their table was the longest 10 yards of Gideon's life. Every step was a fresh wave of humiliation. He could feel the eyes of the other diners on his back, their hushed conversations seeming to pause just as he passed. It was his worst nightmare, realized. He had become a spectacle, a subject of gossip and pity in the very arena he had sought to conquer. He sank back into the velvet banquette, his body feeling unnaturally heavy, as if gravity had chosen to focus its full force on him alone. The atmosphere at their table had been shattered, the former mood of celebratory arrogance replaced by a thick, poisonous silence. The plate of seared scallops the waiter had just delivered sat untouched, the delicate aroma of citrus and butter now smelling nauseatingly rich. Tiffany stared at her own plate with a venomous intensity, her fork frozen in her hand. "Well," she finally hissed, her voice a low, dangerous whisper that barely carried across the table. "That was a disaster. You made us look like complete and utter fools, Gideon." "I didn't do anything," he retorted, his own voice strained. "You did everything," she shot back, her eyes flashing. "You walked over there, puffed up like you owned the place, and you got swatted down like a fly. By her and that old man. He looked right through me, like I was a smudge on the glass." The indignation in her voice was absolute. It was the fury of an idol who had been ignored by a worshipper. Her concern wasn't for his pride, but for her own. Gideon had no defense. He picked up his wine glass, the Chateau Margaux now tasting thin and acidic on his tongue. He took a long, slow swallow, hoping the alcohol would numb the searing shame that was scorching him from the inside out. He risked a glance across the room. Amelia and Lawrence had already resumed their conversation, the disruption seemingly forgotten. They were enclosed in a bubble of shared purpose, a world Gideon had not only been ejected from, but had never been qualified to enter in the first place. The rest of the meal was an exercise in exquisite torture. A waiter, a young man with professionally neutral features, approached to clear their appetizer plates. His movements were swift and silent, but Gideon imagined he could see a flicker of pity in the man's eyes. Every interaction felt freighted with his new, diminished status. The other patrons, paragons of wealth and power, were now a jury delivering a silent verdict. He saw Robert Chen, the venture capital CEO, glance over at him with a look of cold amusement before turning back to his companions. The news of this encounter would be all over their insular world by morning. Gideon Hale, the self-proclaimed apex predator, had been publicly neutered by his mousy ex-wife's new, infinitely more powerful protector. He tried to eat, but the food was tasteless. The A5 Wagyu steak, a cut that cost more than a month's rent on his first apartment with Amelia, was like chewing on ashes. His mind was a maelstrom of rage, jealousy, and a bewildering sense of loss. He kept replaying the scene, dissecting every word, every gesture. Beaumont's glacial dismissal, Amelia's infuriating calm. It was her calmness that stung the most. She hadn't been angry or vindictive. She had been bored. Bored by his predictable, pathetic attempt to assert a long-dead dominance. He had been a minor inconvenience in her spectacular new life. He watched them, his gaze a magnet he couldn't pull away. He saw the way Lawrence's hand briefly covered hers on the table after a shared laugh, a gesture not of possessiveness, but of profound comfort and deep affection. He saw the way she looked at him when he spoke, with an unguarded admiration and intellectual excitement she had never, not once, shown Gideon. Her admiration for Gideon had been for his ambition. Her admiration for Beaumont was for his substance. Theirs was a bond forged in a partnership of equals. She wasn't his accessory. She was his peer, his confidant. She was his queen. Finally, after an eternity that spanned the length of a main course and 2 unwanted glasses of wine, they prepared to leave. Gideon's heart began to pound, a frantic, trapped rhythm against his ribs. A man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, with an earpiece discreetly tucked into his ear, materialized by their table. Beaumont's security. He spoke quietly into his wrist, and like a ghost, another man appeared at the restaurant's main entrance, speaking to the host. A path to the door was being silently, efficiently cleared. As Amelia and Lawrence stood, Jean-Luc, the maître d', hurried over, his usual imperious demeanor replaced by one of solicitous respect. Gideon braced himself, expecting a simple, fawning farewell. Instead, Jean-Luc approached Amelia directly, handing her a slim, elegant leather briefcase that Gideon hadn't noticed before. "Madame," Jean-Luc said, his voice imbued with a reverence Gideon had never heard him use before. The preliminary soil analysis and hydrology reports for the coastal estate came back from the lab this afternoon. As you predicted, the bedrock is perfect for the foundation you designed. The words struck Gideon one by one, each a precision hammer blow against the fragile structure of his ego. "Madame," spoken with the deference due to a woman of immense standing. The coastal estate. The phrase dripped with a level of wealth and permanence that made Gideon's penthouse feel like a transient hotel suite, and the final, killing phrase, "the foundation you designed." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The Helios project was their world-changing professional collaboration. But the coastal estate, that was deeply, irrevocably personal. They weren't just building a city together. They were building a life. A home that she was designing, on a perfect foundation, on a piece of land he couldn't even afford to look at. The wound of his humiliation, still raw and bleeding, was suddenly ripped open into a gaping chasm. Their path to the exit would take them directly past Gideon's table. He held his breath, a knot of dread and morbid anticipation tightening in his stomach. He didn't know what he wanted. A glare, a smirk, a cutting final word. Any acknowledgement would be a kind of victory, a proof that he still mattered enough to hate. Amelia approached, walking with a newfound grace, her focus entirely on the man beside her. As she drew level with Gideon's table, her moment of triumph, he steeled himself. But she didn't even turn her head. Her gaze was fixed forward, on the heavy oak doors, on the night, on the future that awaited her. She passed by him, as if he were a ghost, a piece of furniture, a void. In her world, he had ceased to exist. The ultimate revenge wasn't loud or angry. It was the complete and total erasure of his significance. Lawrence Beaumont, however, did pause. For a single shattering heartbeat, he stopped and turned his head. His cold, grey eyes met Gideon's across the few feet of space that felt like a universe. Gideon saw no anger in them. He saw no triumph, no smug satisfaction. He saw something far more devastating. He saw pity. It was the detached, clinical pity a scientist might feel for a flawed specimen, or a god might give a foolish mortal who had willingly, arrogantly thrown away a divine gift. And that was the cut that severed the last thread of Gideon's pride. To be hated would have made him a rival. To be feared would have made him a threat. but to be pitted by the man who now possessed everything he had so carelessly discarded made him what he truly was: pathetic. The doors of L'Étoile Privée swung shut behind them, leaving Gideon Hale sitting in the wreckage of his own making, the taste of ash in his mouth, and the chilling, absolute certainty that he hadn't just lost a wife, he had lost himself. The fallout from that night was not a sudden, explosive cataclysm. It was a slow, creeping frost, starting at the edges of Gideon's world and moving inexorably inward. The drive home from L'Étoile Privée was a study in suffocating silence. The purr of the Aston Martin's engine, usually a sound that filled him with a sense of power, now seemed hollow and mocking. Tiffany sat rigid in the passenger seat, the glow of her phone screen illuminating a face set in a mask of cold fury. She didn't speak, didn't accuse. Her silence was a judgment far more damning than any tirade. When they arrived at the penthouse, she walked out of the garage without a backward glance, the sharp click of her heels on the polished concrete echoing like gunshots in the stillness. That night, Gideon didn't sleep. He stood before the vast, floor-to-ceiling windows of his living room, a glass of ludicrously expensive Macallan in his hand, and stared at the city lights. Every illuminated skyscraper was a testament to the work of an architect, every crane a symbol of creation. He had always seen the city as a matrix of financial data, a web of assets and liabilities. For the first time, he saw it as a physical space, a world shaped by visionaries, a world shaped by people like Amelia. Lawrence Beaumont's words replayed in his mind, a relentless, torturous loop. We require partners who create value, Mr. Hale, not just extract it. He had been weighed, measured, and found wanting by the one man whose opinion could rewrite reality. The first tremors were subtle. On Monday morning, a call to a key investor went to voicemail, an unprecedented event. Later that day, his regular golf partner, a man who managed a massive pension fund, cancelled their weekly game with a flimsy, transparent excuse about a family matter. These were the small, polite dismissals that signalled a shift in the currents of power. In Gideon's world, you were never told you were out. The doors simply became harder to open, the handshakes a little less firm, the returned calls a little slower, until one day you found yourself on the outside, with no memory of how you'd left the room. The rumour, when it finally surfaced a week later, was a whisper on a Bloomberg terminal, a cryptic line of text from a trusted source about an imminent SEC inquiry into predatory leveraging practices among mid-tier funds. No names were mentioned, but a cold dread coiled in Gideon's stomach. His entire strategy was built on predatory leveraging. He had called it aggressive innovation, but he knew what it was: vulture capitalism, Beaumont's exact words. He felt like a man who had heard a distant rumble and now saw the avalanche coming for him. He knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his gut, the source of the anonymous, impeccably credible tip. It wasn't a direct attack. It was the effortless, almost incidental exercise of power. A titan swatting a fly, not out of anger, but simply to restore order to the air around him. The official news broke on a Tuesday. Hale Capital Management was at the top of the SEC's list. The digital ink was barely dry on the Wall Street Journal's online edition when Tiffany confronted him. She stood in the foyer, flanked by a mountain of Louis Vuitton luggage. "I can't be associated with this, Gideon," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion save for a cold, pragmatic self-interest. "I have a brand to protect. My followers expect a certain aesthetic. Federal investigations aren't part of it." "So that's it?" he asked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "After everything?" "Everything you paid for," she corrected him coolly. "And the contract is up. Your stock is plummeting. I have to diversify my portfolio." She turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the marble-floored cavern of his penthouse. The silence she left behind was absolute. He had meticulously curated a life devoid of genuine connection, and now, in his moment of need, he was reaping the barren harvest. His only real human connection, the one he had forged in a tiny apartment filled with architectural drawings and cheap wine, he had personally, methodically, dismantled years ago. Days bled into weeks. His legal fees were astronomical. Investors, once his loyal disciples, now treated him like a pariah, pulling their capital in a frantic exodus. He was forced to downsize, to let go of the brilliant young analysts he had poached from his rivals. His office, once a humming hive of ambition, grew quiet and sparse. He was a king presiding over a shrinking, debt-ridden kingdom. It was on a bleak, rain-lashed afternoon that the package arrived. It was delivered by a private courier to his nearly empty office, a large, heavy envelope with no return address. His secretary, one of the few remaining staff, placed it on the polished mahogany of his desk with a quiet reverence, as if it were a bomb. For a long time, Gideon just stared at it. He knew instinctively that this was the final act. His hands trembled as he finally tore it open. Inside was a single thick magazine, a special edition of Architectural Digest. The cover took his breath away. It was Amelia. She stood on a wind-swept cliff, the ocean churning a brilliant turquoise behind her. She wore no makeup, and her hair was tousled by the sea breeze. She wasn't smiling for the camera. She was looking out towards the horizon with a serene, powerful confidence. Beside her stood Lawrence Beaumont, his hand resting on her shoulder, not with a sense of ownership, but of profound partnership. He was looking at her, his expression a mixture of awe and immense pride. The headline blared in elegant, bold font. "The Helios Project, Amelia Hale, is building the world of tomorrow." They had used his name, her professional name, a final, subtle assertion of her independent identity. He forced himself to open it. The 20-page spread was a symphony of her triumph. There were stunning photographs of her revolutionary designs, gleaming structures that seemed to grow out of the earth, powered by the sun and sea. There were interviews with critics who hailed her as the most important new voice in a generation. There was a quote from Lawrence Beaumont himself: "True vision is rare. It requires not only genius, but an uncompromising integrity. Amelia possesses both. She isn't just designing a city. She is reminding us of our responsibility to the planet." Gideon scanned the text, his vision blurring. The article briefly touched on her past, framing her years away from the profession not as a period of inactivity, but as a sabbatical of intense observation, a time spent studying the human element of design from within the confines of a conventional life. A conventional life. With him. He had been her case study in mediocrity. Then he saw the final photograph, a full-page spread near the end. It was a candid shot, intimate and devastating. It showed Amelia and Lawrence on the sprawling, sun-drenched grounds of a magnificent coastal estate. They were standing on the newly laid foundation of a house, looking over a set of blueprints spread across a wooden table. Amelia was laughing, her head tilted back in pure, unadulterated joy, and Lawrence was watching her, his guard down, his face filled with an expression of such profound, unconditional love that it was a physical blow to Gideon. This wasn't the look of a client or a partner. It was the look of a man who had found his entire world in one person. The caption was a simple, brutal sentence: Beyond Helios, Beaumont and Hale review the plans for their future home in Carmel, a personal project designed by Hale herself. He let the magazine fall from his hands. It landed open on the floor, the image of their shared laughter staring up at the empty ceiling. The sound echoed in the crushing silence of his office. He had told her she would be nothing without him. He had defined her life as a reflection of his own. But the truth was, she had been a sun, and he had been a tiny, insignificant planet who thought her light shone only for him. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost his one chance at witnessing true brilliance, and now he was left in the cold, outer darkness of his own making, haunted by the ghost of a life lived beautifully, a life he could see, but never, ever touch. And so, Gideon Hale learned the hardest lesson of all. A person's worth is not determined by who they are with, but by who they are. He threw away a diamond because he was too busy chasing glitter and was left with nothing but dust. Amelia, on the other hand, rebuilt her life not on revenge, but on the solid foundation of her own talent, passion, and self-worth. She proved that the most powerful thing you can do to someone who underestimates you is to succeed on a scale they can't even comprehend. Her story is a powerful reminder that our past does not have to define our future. What did you think of Amelia's incredible journey? Have you ever had a moment where you proved someone wrong in the most satisfying way possible? Let me know your stories in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of karma and triumph, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next dramatic story. Thanks for listening.